Good morning, dealers, or for some of you, good afternoon. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us. My name is Haley Holland, and I'm the Marketing Program Manager here at ARI. I'm excited to be joined today by Fran O'Hagan, CEO of Pied Piper, who will be talking to us about the best ways to respond to website customers and best online practices. Before we move forward, I wanted to take this opportunity to point out the control panel on the top corner of your screen, which you can minimize at any time by hitting the orange arrow. You can also submit questions throughout the webinar in the questions section of the control panel. We have reserved time at the end to answer as many questions as we're able, and we'll be sending out a recording following the presentation. So as I mentioned, Fran's going to go over ways dealers are responding to website customers. He's going to review his 2020 ILE scores, how we can practice best online customer outreach, how dealers can apply these best practices in their dealership, and how can we make them habits. Ultimately, we want you guys to be able to sell more stuff. So again, my name is Haley Holland, Marketing Program Manager here at ARI. I have worked with dealerships and manufacturers to develop business and marketing plans to accelerate results and in turn yield a higher ROI. With that said, I'm so excited to welcome you back, Fran O'Hagan. Thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
So a quick second, I want to just introduce Fran formally. Fran's the CEO at Pied Piper Management Company, founded in 2003 in the sunny state of California. Pied Piper helps dealerships and manufacturers improve the performance of their retail networks. Their main objective is to get higher retail sales, higher market share, higher profitability, and higher customer loyalty. Fran, again, excited to have you back today to speak with our dealers.
My pleasure.
So, Fran, some of our dealers tuning in may have joined us on our last webinar, but for those that aren't familiar with Pied Piper, do you mind telling us a little more about your company?
Sure. So many dealers will be familiar with Pied Piper from our Prospect Satisfaction Index, or PSI reports. These are reports that measure and help improve how a dealership sales team sells, either selling in person or selling digitally. Often these reports are provided to the dealers through your manufacturer. So many of you may already be getting them. And if not, it's also something that dealers can order online. Visit piedpiperpsi.com. So we also provide annual industry studies using the PSI measurements. And those studies tell us how does the performance for each brand's entire network compare. How do dealers selling Kawasaki compare to dealers selling Polaris or dealers selling John Deere? And this week we released the 2020 UTV and motorcycle internet lead effectiveness industry study. So let's talk a little bit more about that. Internet lead effectiveness, or ILE, it measures, or it answers the question, let's say, what happens when a customer visits a dealership website and inquires about a vehicle? Does the dealership reply? And if the dealership does reply, how quickly and how effectively do they reply? The industry study independently measured a sample of US dealerships for 32 different brands that sell either UTVs or motorcycles, a total of 6,012 different dealerships for the 2020 study. It was completed between July of last year and February of this year, and importantly, it was completed before the coronavirus pandemic began. And speaking of the coronavirus pandemic, I had to include this cartoon. Let's read it. Digital transformation is years away. I don't see our company having to change anytime soon. And of course, on the left is a quote from the Wall Street Journal about a month ago. The new coronavirus pandemic is deepening a national digital divide, amplifying gains for businesses that cater to customers online, while businesses reliant on more traditional models fight for survival. So what does this all mean? Well, we all know that dealers responding to web customers, that was critical to success before. But now moving forward, it's even more critical. And I'm going to share some data with you that's going to tell you that your customers are visiting your dealer websites right now. Check out this chart. Dealership front doors may be closed. Hopefully they're reopening, but your websites have been open and are open right now. And power sports, outdoor power equipment, ag customers, they are active online right now. This data in the chart actually comes from ARI and DealerSpike. The light blue line is 2019, from January until a week ago. The dark blue line, or maybe that's purple, that is this year. And we see this drop when we hit the middle of March, right? You see where that is, kind of where that green arrow starts. But look what happens afterward. The 2020 leads at your dealerships, they catch up to the 2019 level and then go rocketing right by it. And you know, anyone who knows me will say that I'm a glasses half full type of guy. I'm an optimist. So when all of this coronavirus ridiculousness began, I probably would have said, hey, customers are going to get tired of being locked up in their home. And if they like motorcycles or UTVs or tractors or whatever your product is, they're going to start shopping for them. And that's exactly what has happened.
Wow, Fran, these are incredible and surprising results. It really is amazing to see that online traffic has all but stopped, instead it actually increased. So, Fran, can you help our dealers understand how Pied Piper's ILE score is calculated and what does it mean for a dealership?
Absolutely. So let's go through some of the study details. There are 20 different measurements that generate an ILE score, and the scores are very simple. They range from 0, terrible, to 100 or perfect. And I want to draw your attention to two numbers. Do you see this green bullet here that says 13% of dealers nationally score 70 or higher? You see that? And then you see beneath it, there's another green bullet that says 36% of dealers nationally score below 30. So 13% are scoring above 70, 36% are scoring below 30. The best brand for scoring over 70 is the Harley-Davidson network. About 620 or so dealers, roughly a third of them score over 70. And if we take a look at the dealers who score below 30, the best brand for that, meaning you don't want very many of those dealers, is Indian Motorcycle. Only 21% of their dealers score below 30. But let's stop for a minute. Let's talk about what it is to score over 70 and what it is to score under 30. First of all, under 30. If you're scoring under 30, through the eyes of the customer, it means that the customer is getting no personal response. 24 hours comes and goes, and they get nothing. That is 4 out of 10 dealers across this country who are selling UTVs and motorcycles. 4 out of 10 dealers are giving the customers no personal response whatsoever. On the other hand, the dealers who are scoring over 70, what does that look like? Well, that means that through the eyes of the customer, the dealer is quickly composing an email that answers their question and hitting send, and then picking up the phone and calling them, and a number of other things as well. So basically, the dealership has a comprehensive process that they execute quickly, really do everything they can to help the customer. So we're seeing that, let's call it 1 out of 10 dealers nationally are in that category of doing everything right, and 4 out of 10 nationally are really doing nothing. Now, probably the most important sentence in this whole presentation is the last one on this page, all the way at the bottom. Moving a dealer from scoring less than 30, or basically doing nothing, to scoring 70 plus where you're doing a comprehensive reply and helping the customer, that generates 44% more retails on average from the same quantity of customers coming through your website.
Very interesting. Fran, it does look like, so the ILE score tells us a lot about how a dealership handles their leads. Can you tell us if there's room for growth?
Yes, without question there is. If we take a look at industry-wide, what did we see this year compared to last year? The first bullet on this slide says there was widespread improvement. The average ILE score this year was a 42, last year was a 33. So nice improvement. However, if you think about it, many of you have kids. If your kids bring home a report card and they got a 42, you're going to say, hey, you need to work harder. That's a 42 out of 100. So there's still all kinds of room for improvement. But to be fair, there was improvement from last year. The second bullet, more use of dealers' text messages. If we look at last year and compare it to this year, last year in power sports, texting really wasn't used. And now 19% of the time, or in other words, if 5 customers reach out to dealers to buy UTVs, one of those 5 customers is going to get a text message back. Interestingly, for the auto industry, it's roughly half right now. More emailed answers to questions. So when customers contact dealerships through the dealer website today, 43% of the time, the customers will get back an emailed answer to their question. A year ago, that was only 33%. Next one, more personal emails sent quickly. And by quickly, I mean within an hour. That happens now about 1 time out of 3, 21% last year. Fewer very poor ILE scores this year. But I want to draw your attention to the last bullet. You see what that says? Even larger variety in performance by brand and dealer. What do I mean by that? Well, there are still plenty of dealers and plenty of brands scoring very poorly, basically not replying to their customers. But this year, for the first time, we have 2 brands that are scoring over 50, or basically they're scoring similarly to an auto brand. So there's a huge variation, and we're going to see that in the scores.
Well, it is great to see that the industry as a whole has seen some actual growth year over year. But I am really excited to know who came out top and who scored the highest score in 2020.
Right. So Harley-Davidson finished on top. This is the second year that Harley-Davidson has finished on the top of this industry study. But importantly, this year there were 6 brands that finished at or above Harley's score from last year. So last year you had Harley and then a bunch of other brands. This year, 6 brands performed as well as Harley did last year. Harley-Davidson and Indian Motorcycle were the 2 that pulled away from the rest of the industry this year.
That's awesome, and well done, everyone. Fran, I'm sure dealers are excited to see how each brand performed in the different categories you've prepared for us today. But before we jump into that, I see a ton of questions coming in from dealers, and so awesome. We're excited to get to those later on. But I do see a popular question just asking again if we're recording, and the answer is yes, we are recording, and we'll send you a recording following the presentation. All right, Fran, I'm excited to see those results.
So as I noted, Harley-Davidson up at the top with a 56, Indian with a 54, and this is the first time, as I said, that anybody has been higher than a 43, which was Harley-Davidson's score last year. You see the black line industry average is a 42, and if you look all the way at the bottom of the page, we see that there are a bunch of brands down here. Remember what we learned about the score of 30. So if a brand is averaging 30 across their network, that really is telling you that their customers are going to be frustrated with what happens when they try to reach out to the dealerships. I also want to draw your attention to the small graph in the upper right-hand corner, the one that says 3-year performance. It has something very important on it, and that is if you look at the red line, That shows what the Harley-Davidson network has done 2018, 2019, 2020, and we see huge improvement. So the entire Harley-Davidson network has improved dramatically. The point I want to make to all of you, because of course many of you are not Harley-Davidson dealers, the point is it can be done on a dealership level too. You absolutely can change your behaviors, and you're rewarded by increased web lead close rates, or in other words, you sell more units. I have 3 examples that I'm going to share with you today, and then we're going to move on and talk about best practices. So let's look at these 3 individual measurements. The first one is going to be, did an email answer to the customer's question within 24 hours? So we see John Deere at the top. This says that the typical John Deere customer is going to find that the dealer will answer their question about 60% of the time. Or in other words, if 10 John Deere customers reach out to dealers, 6 of those 10 are going to get email answers back within 24 hours. Now, if we just stop and think about it, that means 4 out of 10 are not going to get an emailed answer to their question, and that's for the best brand. There's some brands down at the bottom of this page that are much less likely to reach out to their customers by email. And again, if we look in the upper right-hand corner at the 3-year performance, and we look at that red line, we see that the Harley-Davidson network started in 2018, answering the customers only about 17% of the time, and now they're doing it 50. 50 is still terrible, but it's a whole lot better than 17. So email was the first. I'm also going to talk about phone reply and texting. Phone reply, we see that the Harley-Davidson dealers reply about 3/4 of the time by phone. They'll try to call the customer, but you see the huge variation. Look at the bottom of the page, and we see a dozen brands where less than 20% of the time they reach out to the customer and try to speak with them by phone. The last item that I'm going to share with you from the study is texting. So we looked at email reply, we looked at phone reply, and now let's look at texting. So the Harley-Davidson network, about 40% of the time, if you reach out to a Harley dealer through their website, you will get a text response back. But we see that there are a dozen brands where their dealers really just don't text at all. And I can tell you that in the past year, the brands that we see up here, Yamaha, Kawasaki, and Suzuki, BRP, that have at least some texting, a year ago they had less than half as much. This is something that has increased dramatically recently, and we're going to talk a little bit more about texting when we get to best practices.
Wow, thanks, Fran, for showing us these awesome analytics. It's really great to see that brands are starting to take on texting, as we've seen that as a popular trend throughout the auto industry. But what do all these statistics mean, and what's the bottom line of your study?
So if we summarize all of this, because we really want to get through this and talk about best practices, in other words, what can you do at your dealership? But if we summarize the study, the bottom line is that every power sports, outdoor power equipment, and ag brand still has plenty of room for improvement. We saw that target for an ILE score is a 70 plus, and none of the brands, even Harley-Davidson with a 56, is at that 70 level. But for individual dealers, there are plenty that are already scoring 70 plus, 13% nationally. That's actually a lot of dealers. But that also means, of course, that 87% are not scoring above 70. And about 4 out of 10, 36%, are currently scoring below 30. Or in other words, they're really doing nothing at all to help customers who reach out to them. So there's plenty of room for improvement for everybody. The last item that we'll mention before we move on to best practices, if all of this math is interesting to you and you want to learn more about the industry study, just Google Pied Piper PSI. A website will come up and you can click on recent press where you can read more about what some publications have written about the study, as well as a press release there. But let's move on to best practices.
Excellent. And I just want to summarize, the data speaks for itself, and dealers, it's extremely important to reply to incoming leads, especially after seeing the data Pied Piper has collected. So let's dive into best practices, and I want to know what dealers can do specifically to improve and see better results.
So I'm going to share 5 simple best practices with everyone. And to make it clear, if we all could snap our fingers and your dealerships would follow these 5 best practices, you would outperform about 70 or 80% of the dealerships out there. So there are 5 of them. The first one is measure and track your process. You guys have heard the saying, if you measure it, it will change. And that's absolutely true if you talk about your process for handling customer web inquiries. Now, one way to do this, of course, is to look at your ILE reports. ILE reports are a 9-page PDF. They're emailed directly to dealers either once or twice a month. Usually they are arranged by the manufacturer. So the manufacturer arranges to have them sent to the dealers. If your manufacturer doesn't do that, you absolutely can order them yourself if you go to piedpiperpsi.com. I want you to think of ILE reports as a flashlight shining on what dealership customers are really experiencing right now. That's what's so important. They track whether a salesperson's web response is by email, but they also track whether the salesperson replied by phone or replied by text. They report whether an email actually answers the customer's question, as opposed to just that an email was sent. And they also report whether the dealership's digital process. If you think about it, you have a lot of moving parts. You have a website, many of you have a CRM system, you have email, you have chat possibly. The report tells whether any of those pieces have broken. A lot of times that will be invisible. You won't know when it has broken. And lastly, the ILE reports reflect the customer's complete experience. There are 20 different measurements. So that was the first of 5, measure and track your process. The second of these 5 best practices, make sure you have an autoresponder set up, but only one. You don't want to have your website send out an autoresponder, your CRM system send out an autoresponder, and maybe if the lead's coming from your manufacturer, they're sending out an autoresponder. Because of course, from the customer's perspective, they will receive all of these emails, and of course, none of them will answer their question. So make sure it's set up correctly and there's only one going out. Number 3, quick personal reply. So if you can, you want to target 60 minutes, within 60 minutes. Now, for some dealerships, that's just not in the cards. You aren't going to be able to do that. And if that's the case, then always within 24 hours. And the way to do that is our quote right there. Don't go home at the end of the day with digital customers locked up in your dealership, any more so than you would go home at the end of the day with physical customers still wandering around the store. So before you leave for the day, send emails answering all of your customers' questions. But I'm going to tell you that 18% of your customers on average, figure 1 out of 5, they will never see your email. Your email is going to go into their junk mail. Now, as soon as you hit send on that email, you have to pick up the phone and call them. And I'm going to tell you that 24% of the customers on average, they will never speak with you and they will not listen to your voicemail. So we just saw 2 numbers that are somewhat alarming. 18% of your emails won't make it through, and 24% of your phone calls won't make it through. So how do we fix that? And the answer is you have to always email and call. In the old days, we used to ask the customer, hey, how would you like for us to communicate with you? And the customer would say email, and then we would email them or call. Those days are gone. Your emails landing in customer junk mail, that is so much of a problem. Or Us, us Americans, we won't answer the cell phone if we don't know what the number is, and we won't listen to our voicemail. But if you add these together, if you both email and phone, the math says that you will reach 95% of your customers. And number 5, if you don't speak with the customer on the phone, and that clearly is your objective, that is far more powerful a way of communicating than anything by email or text. So if you don't talk with them on the phone, then text them. Now, if you're using an automated texting system, in other words, you're not texting from a cell phone, you do have to make sure your website always obtains customer permission first. There's a very specific law, TCPA, that requires that. If you don't have an automated texting system, you certainly can use a cell phone. There's no TCPA requirement. And I'm going to tell you, use texting the way you use it with your friends, which is to say, brief, concise, no paragraph long texts. Texting does not replace emails, and it does not replace phone calls. Given your choice, you want to speak with them on the phone. But texting is a good way to reach somebody to make sure that your emails and phone calls are getting through.
Absolutely. Fran, these are great practices that everyone listening can apply to their daily lives, and hopefully close on those sales or sales leads that have been coming in. But I gotta ask, are there more best practices our dealers could be doing?
So we talked about 5, right? 5 basic ones. What about more? What about extras? And I have half a dozen here for you. So the way I would have you think about this is, first focus on those 5 that we were just talking about. Those are the basics. Those are the ones that are going to transform a dealership from doing nothing to being, a powerful responder to your web customers. The half a dozen that I have on this page, that's sort of the next level. And notice that if you look at this page, there are a bunch of numbers on it, percentages. Those percentages tell you industry-wide what percentage of the time do dealers do these things right now. So let's start up at the top. First of all, include a salesperson's direct email address. So in other words, fran@o'haganmotors.com, as opposed to web reply at 12345.com. So give them an actual salesperson's email address. Give them the dealership's phone number. Give them the dealership's physical address in your emails. Invite the customer to visit the dealership at a set time. Industry-wide, this is still very low, 7%. But we do have brands now in the industry that are 25, 30% of the time. And in the auto industry, this is way over 50% of the time. Why should the customer buy now versus 3 months from now? So give them some reason. This model is in short supply. We have a special running for the next 30 days, whatever it is. Why should a customer buy from your dealership instead of just selling the product? In other words, there are plenty of dealers where the customer can buy the product, but only one dealership is your dealership. And the second to last bullet, always list a price. And MSRP is fine. If your thing is not to deep discount, that's up to you, of course. But what we can tell you from the math, it's very, very clear. If you do not list a price, you do not sell as many vehicles. The last is what's some additional information you can provide about the vehicle to confirm that the customer is making a good choice. And that happens right now about 51% of the time.
Awesome. Thank you, Fran. Really appreciate those additionals. And I challenge you all to try to apply these to your daily life, and let the math speak for itself.
So we covered 2 different topics. The first was we shared the 2020 industry study results for UTVs and motorcycles. We saw that Harley-Davidson and Indian dealers kind of pulled themselves away from the rest of the pack. There's a lot of variety, But we probably most importantly, we learned about the difference between scoring a 70 plus or scoring under 30. We found that industry-wide, 4 in 10 dealers are scoring below 30, which just means that they're doing nothing at all to help their web customers who contact them. So there's plenty of room for improvement there. We also found that about 1 in 10 dealers nationally are scoring over 70, where they're really doing everything they can to reply quickly and completely to their customers. We also talked about best practices. So the 5 that we focused on, one was measure and track your process. Be sure you see exactly what's happening. We talked about how the ILE reports are a flashlight shining on what's really happening. We talked about number 2, making sure your autoresponder is set up, and there's only one of them. Number 3, we talked about before the end of the day, emailing an answer to customer questions, and then immediately picking up the phone and calling your customers. We talked about texting, how if you're using an automated texting system, you need to have customer permission to text first because of the TCPA law. If you're using a cell phone, you don't need to have their permission first. And then we went through half a dozen extras if you are already achieving those 5 best practices.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Fran. Dealers, I want to open up for questions. And once again, you can maximize the control panel by clicking on that orange arrow in the top corner of your screen and submitting your questions in the question section. All right, so Fran, first question I've got for you. My agriculture dealership replies to a lead initially via email, then we follow up by phone, then our sales manager shoots a text. But what happens next?
Gotcha. So what I would suggest is if you're using all 3 the way we've been describing, then pay attention to how the customer replies to you. So of course, if the customer calls you, you're going to call the customer back. If the customer emails you, you'll email them back, or text and then text back. So once you have begun the communication, then I would take your lead from whatever the customer starts to use to communicate back with you.
Excellent. Same dealer is actually asking, is it okay if I just text a reply without calling or sending an email?
Right. So texting does not replace either emails or phone calls. I mean, it's very powerful, and eventually the customer may make it clear that that's the way they want you to communicate. There still will be instances where you have a lot of information to give them that you'll need to use an email, or if you're trying to arrange some details, it may be helpful to talk on the phone. So in time, I would allow the customer to make the call, but initially, I would absolutely make sure to use all 3.
Awesome. Dealer just sent in asking, Fran, you mentioned pricing before, but I'm hesitant to list price. What's your recommendations for that? Is it better to call for price than not list a price at all?
So we know, this is an interesting topic, and it's a topic where we, Pied Piper, have some interesting information, and the Dealer Spike ARI folks, their information that they see is exactly the same as what we see. And that is, you do not want to have no price listed in your email. You want to have a price. It can absolutely be MSRP. It doesn't need to be a discounted price. Your thing may be to have a best price that you provide, or it may be to provide MSRP, and either one of those are fine. The big drop in web lead close rates comes from providing no price. Why is this? Well, it's because us humans, if we're buying something, it doesn't really matter what it is. The very first thing we use to decide whether it's something we should consider or not is price. So you don't want to have somebody rule you out because of price. The question about a call now button or call for best price or something like that, I would absolutely list MSRP.
Awesome. I have a dealer asking, what if I've not received an ILE report? How do I get a hold of a copy?
Gotcha. So if it's something that is being provided, if your manufacturer is providing ILE reports for you, then it's something that you can access through the Pied Piper PSI web application. And we can help you with that. If you call Pied Piper, we can give you your login details. If your manufacturer is not providing ILE reports for you and you just want to order them yourself, you can do that as well. You can log on to piedpiperpsi.com and you can order ILE reports online.
Awesome. I have a dealer asking, I'm a boat and trailer dealer. Oh, sorry, dealership. Do you offer analytics for those verticals?
Yes, absolutely. So the boat dealers can't order evaluations online like you could if you were selling motorcycles or UTVs or other products. But all you need to do is contact Pied Piper and we can help you.
That's awesome. A follow-up question from that same dealer. What about agriculture? You mentioned OPE and power sports, but I don't know if you offer ag too.
Absolutely do. The most popular product category within ag is compact tractor. And then in OPE, we do riding mowers as well.
Awesome. Great questions, dealers. I've got a couple more. Fran, can you tell me different ways I can personalize text messages and email responses?
Interesting. So what I would encourage for texting, we all have friends, or maybe you have a spouse who has friends who the friend sends paragraph long text messages. And whenever we receive something like that, we kind of roll our eyes. That's just not really the way texting is used. Texting is very short and concise. I would follow that model where if the customer is asked a question, I would answer the question. I would identify my name, who I am, and what dealership I'm from. And that's probably about it. It's interesting with texting, if you try to attach multimedia or you try to, images or video or whatever, we have found that occasionally will torpedo the text. The text won't actually go through. So the very first response, I would keep it very brief and short and let the customer respond to you. And then after that, maybe you can be a little more adventurous with your texting.
Awesome. All right, last question for you, Fran. My dealership does a good job of hitting the first 5 best practices. Can you tell us again what else we could be doing to improve? Sure.
So if you think about what makes a successful web response, quickly answering the customer's question is the answer to that. And you can't rely just on email, as we've seen, because emails land in customers' junk mail and they don't see it. You can't just rely on phone calls because the customer won't answer the phone. You'll leave a voicemail and then they won't listen to the voicemail. So the solution to that was to do both, or to use texting on top of that. You think about it. The typical industry response, we looked at the ILE scores and we saw that the industry average was a 42, which is pretty awful and far from a 70. The way to get closer to the 70 is to focus on those 5 best practices that we talked about. But there are a growing number of dealers that have accomplished those 5. And for them, the next thing to do are some of those things that we discussed, those half a dozen extras, which make your response even more powerful.
That's awesome. All right, well, thank you so much, Fran, for joining us again and sharing one amazing ILE score. I'm really glad to see the improvement and 2, these awesome best practices. I know our dealers are going to benefit from it. And thank you, dealers, for taking the time to tune in and just join us today. Thank you again, and everyone, have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Take care, everybody.